Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host Michael on a Saturday, joined by returning guest John Salza. We're going to be talking about the Society of St. Pius X. But first, welcome back to the show, John. How are you?
Hey, great, Michael. Doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I have to commend you for the video you did with Pints with Aquinas. By the way, if y'all have not seen it yet, John went and did 3 hours in person in studio with Matt Fradd on Pints with Aquinas, where he discussed for about 2.5 hours the question of the SSPX, and then for a good 30 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, the question of Sedevacantism. So if y'all have not seen that yet, go ahead and watch it. It was incredible. So like I said, I just have to commend you. It was just such a good interview and so much to glean from it, and quite frankly, very timely.
Thank you, Michael. When I walked away from that, there was still a lot more I wanted to say. In 3 hours and 15 minutes, because there is a lot to say. But I think, we got the substance out there, and people are, I'm getting emails, and I mean this literally every day, from people who have been longtime patrons of the society who are now recognizing a lot of the issues that I've presented. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, it was incredibly helpful. And I also want to mention to people an article you had just put out. Both you and I were falsely accused recently. The newest accusation is that we lied about Marcel Lefebvre celebrating the new mass for a few years. I want to point everybody to an article that John wrote a few weeks back. I put it in the show notes. In fact, I'll just share my screen real quick so y'all can see the title of it and go and check it out. It's at trueorfalsepope.com. Again, a direct link is there in the show notes. The article is, Did Archbishop Lefebvre Say the New Mass? Kennedy Hall Only Makes Things Worse for Lefebvre and the SSPX is the title. Again, February 2023. Highly recommended that you go and read this, because it gives you the nitty gritty when it comes to the question of whether or not Lefebvre celebrated the new mass and whether or not we're liars and things like that. I find it interesting that what I'm saying from SSPX apologists consistently is a desire for character assassination rather than addressing the apologetic objections directly. Have you noticed that as well?
I have, Michael. There's a presumption of malice, and that's the problem. If you look at even the Society's position on Vatican II, there is the presumption of error and heresy, and intention to convey error and heresy from a lot of perspectives. So that's the problem. I mean, it's one thing to say we disagree factually with
Yeah,
whether Archbishop Lefebvre celebrated the Mass, and
sure.
I still would concede it's a question of fact. I've claimed, and you've claimed, and we've shown we have a factual basis for that assertion. Don't
Yeah,
accuse us of calumny or intentionally denigrating his reputation, because
yeah,
there's a factual basis for it. And if that factual basis can be modified, or if it's an error, then we're happy to concede that. But
yeah.
that it hasn't been disproven to me at this point, and certainly it wasn't done to denigrate the Archbishop's reputation. If anything,
Sure.
I was trying to show that he was open to the reforms and he had good faith, at least at the beginning. That really was my intent.
Yeah, it was a good thing. But I mean, I guess from the SSPX perspective, if we say that he celebrated the new mass, that's a slander in their eyes, because in fact, the SSPX says even the best celebrated Novus Ordo is an offense to God and contains poison. So I guess for them, it's a
Yeah.
slander. But yeah, I just find it interesting. You put out a good 3 hours of material. In fact, way more with Dom on the
Yeah.
Logos project. Plenty of content on the SSPX, just putting out hours and hours and hours of argumentation against certain matters related to the SSPX. I've done the same. I have an SSPX playlist where I've leveled all kinds of arguments and responses to the SSPX. And rather than hearing an engagement with the substantive claims, what we literally hear are petty questions like this, side questions
Yeah.
that frankly are irrelevant, because our critiques really don't stand or fall with whether or not he celebrated the new mass. It's really
Not at
irrelevant
all.
to the majority of things we said. So
It's
I
not
just find it
relevant.
I just find it interesting that there's a lack of engagement with the substantive claims, but then there's these little petty quarrels about something that you said off the cuff, or I said off the cuff here and there. So
Michael, it's being recognized actually in the communications that I receive, and it's
mhm.
it's the fact that they haven't engaged with the substance of the arguments, with the issues of canonical mission and jurisdiction, and all that people are recognizing there's crickets out there. We can
Yeah.
talk about the latest attempt to whitewash a lot of the history, which is what I would call it, but there hasn't been an engagement really with the substantive arguments.
Yeah, unfortunately. And speaking of which, the reason why I invited you onto the show yesterday, there was an interview between Eric Sammons from Crisis Magazine and Jim Vogel,
Mhm.
who is the U.S. Director of Communications for the SSPX, and they were talking about the SSPX, but I felt that it was mostly softballs and it wasn't really engaging the more substantive critiques that have been leveled against the SSPX. And so I did a review of it last night, and I already gave my thoughts on the interview.
Okay.
So I'm not going to really give a whole lot of my thoughts here. Again, people want to know my thoughts. Go and watch the show yesterday. I invited you on the show because I want to know, what are your thoughts about the video. So
Thank
maybe,
you.
yeah, so maybe just kind of give us a brief introduction here to your evaluation of the video, which I did include in the show notes. If you want to go and watch the interview between Sammons and Vogel, highly encourage you to do that so you have context for this discussion. So again, click on the link in the show notes and you can go and watch it later on, or go and watch that first and come back and watch this. Either way is fine with me. But yeah, go ahead and give an introduction of your thoughts here.
Sure, Michael. I saw the video last night and I watched it very carefully, and I took 4 pages of detailed notes on what was communicated. And look, let me say this. I know Jim Vogel. I've known him for quite a while. I like Jim. I think he's a good guy,
Yeah,
and I think he's in a tough spot. When I
yeah,
did a conference with the Angelus Press at the Angelus Conference, I think in 2017, Jim and I hung out all weekend and I got to know him. But
yeah,
Jim's not only defending the Society of St. Pius X. I mean, he's in a tough spot because I think he's really defending a career decision he made 18 years ago. And now he's in this position of, directing public communications on the society. And I don't knock him for that at all. He's doing his job and he's doing his best. But I would say, I think respectfully, he's whitewashed, again, a lot of the history and the background, beginning with the formation of the society all the way through the consecrations. And I think there were many omissions, very critical omissions in that interview that have to be addressed today.
yeah. I did note some omissions, and I brought up a few, but I'm sure you have plenty of others that you want to address. Let's maybe start with the formation of the SSPX, because that kind of was touched upon a little bit,
Yeah,
but there were a lot of details that obviously, I mean, look, to be fair to him, you can't cover everything in an interview, right? I mean, you do kind of have to be brief and concise, and you're also
right.
limited to what the interviewer is asking you and things like that. But
Yeah,
just for a balanced perspective, let's maybe talk a little bit about the formation of the SSPX. Give us a little history here.
yeah, and this is in no way intending to say Jim intentionally misled or anything like that. We're not trying
Sure,
to trap him, but we're trying to add some further perspective and clarity.
sure.
Just out of the gate, Michael, when Jim says that the society is a priestly society and a religious order, that is not true, at least from a canonical perspective. From the very beginning, the society was actually founded as a pious union. That's what the local decree of the bishop said. That's what the society's own statutes say. And a pious union is distinct from a priestly society. In fact, the canonists at the time of the 17 Code was saying that that's merely a lay association without a juridic personality, if you will. So it is not a priestly society. And whether we want to debate whether it is or not, the reality is it was suppressed in 1975. In
Mm.
which case, if it did have a juridical status under the canon law, well, when it was suppressed, it was wiped off the canonical map of the Catholic Church. And so it is not a priestly society. What it really is technically a confederation of Vegas priests, acephalous priests, that is, priests without a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. So, I want to make that clear right from the
Mhm.
get-go. Jim mentioned that they use the term chapels, and that's true. We called when I used to attend, we called it a chapel, and Jim admits that they use that term because it's not a parish, because a parish would be under a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. And if you think about that concession, we're calling these society churches chapels because they're not organized under a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. I mean, that's an admission that they don't have authorization to operate, right?
Yeah.
They're operating independently from the princes of the Catholic Church. So, that's a real problem. And I think the other thing that was omitted is, a failure to acknowledge that when the society was founded as a pious union, it was founded upon a temporary provisional basis called an ad experimentum basis, a period of 6 years, which Archbishop Lefebvre, agreed to, under, Michael, the authority of the local bishop. And so, as Jim moved on in the interview, and the society's position itself is that, hey, we were lawfully formed and hence had a right to continue to exist. That's not true, because even if you weren't suppressed, you had a canonical shelf life of 6 years, and at the time of 1976, you wouldn't have existed anymore. You see, so that's a history that people have to understand. The society was erected as a lay association on an ad experimentum temporary provisional basis, and was scheduled to expire in 1976 unless the institution would have been renewed by the local bishop and the Holy See.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about how the suppression of the SSPX happened? A little bit of the background there, because I know this was briefly touched on.
It was briefly touched on in the Vogel interview, and he did refer to the 1974 declaration of Marcel Lefebvre, where Marcel Lefebvre, I think, after experiencing two apostolic visitators, which Jim referred to, and the fact that they had made some scandalous comments, that was followed by Lefebvre effectively declaring that he was, not wanting anything to do with neo-Protestant or neo-modernist Rome, which, is quite interesting. How does the fact that two apostolic visitators come through the seminary and make some comments justify you to issue a declaration saying, hey, guys, I'm separating from neo-Protestant, neo-modernist Rome? I mean, were these visitators representing the new dogmatic, position of the Roman Catholic Church? It's quite odd, but what came out in that interview, I think, Jim kind of spun it, to make one believe that Lefebvre was suppressed and, he was blindsided by this suppression. That's really not the case. After Lefebvre, issued this declaration, and I'm not saying some scandalous things may or may not have been said, and we're also not saying there was some craziness that was going on at the time with the liturgy, with doctrines and all that. We're not trying to downplay that. The question is whether he overreacted, whether this, reaction was excessive. And this ultimate suppression, which was levied in 1965, this didn't come out of nowhere and blindside Lefebvre. He was first given opportunities to clarify his declaration, to modify it, to retract it. He didn't do any of that. And then he was warned about the suppression. He went forward without any type of retraction or modification. He was then suppressed, and then again warned not to go forward and carry out ordinations, which he ignored as well. And then after that, he was suspended from ordaining, and finally suspended from all priestly functions. So this was not a process that just happened out of nowhere. He was given opportunities to clarify his position. And the more he was given the opportunities from the historical record, as I read it, Michael, the more he dug in his heels, the more he really put a target on his back. And I maintain did an incredible disservice to the cause of tradition, because he had it going. He had the authority to form these young men into traditional priests, but he put a target on his back. And as Eric Sammons even said in that interview, I think he should have exercised more patience. I would agree with Eric on that.
Yeah, so more patience, maybe not putting a target on his back. I mean, look, at the end of the day, let's say, the society, it was clear, wasn't going to be renewed. So what was he to do? Just kind of let it go and just trust in the providence of God? I mean, what do you think should have been done?
Well, remember, Archbishop Lefebvre had no authority to incardinate these seminarians.
Yeah.
As the decree says, and as the society statutes say, their entire existence depended upon the authority of the local bishop. Lefebvre had no right to ordain or incardinate these priests, because the society was not an entity eligible to receive priests through incardination. This all depended upon the local bishop. And so if I were him, as a matter of prudence, I would have wanted to make sure that my relationship with that local bishop who had given me approval was good, so that I could carry on this ministry. That was a big problem. He took matters into his own hands, and actually by doing that, he acted inconsistent with his own agreement with the bishop and inconsistent with the society statutes themselves.
Mm. Now, wouldn't they probably say, but, state of necessity and things like that allows for him to carry out his mission and stuff like that? What would you say in response to that?
Well, it depends what you're talking about. A state of necessity, as you know, never justifies a schismatic act, and
Sure.
ultimately, one can argue whether he went into schism before '88. I think he did, but at least if you want to pinpoint the definitive act, it would be the consecrations of 1988. And of course, all Catholics should know that no state of necessity would justify a schismatic
Mm.
act, which in this case would be usurping a right of the Roman pontiff that belongs to him as a matter of divine law.
In the homily that he issues during the illicit consecrations of the bishops, he's quite clear in there that he thinks through these ordinations, tradition, capital T, by the way, tradition itself is going to be preserved. So it seems that he was under the impression, unless he does this,
Yeah.
sacred tradition is not going to be preserved. It's as if he thought that he's the one who carries forward sacred tradition, not Rome. Which, you know what, contextually makes sense for Lefebvre, because he had already said that effectively the Pope was the Antichrist. The one who sits in the see of
Yes.
Saint Peter was the Antichrist. I want to share something on my
Yeah.
screen, because I pulled this up right before the show. Here's something that Lefebvre says, and this is on the SSPX website. This is in 87, August 29 of 87. Do you recall the date of the ordination of the four bishops? When was that?
That was June 30 of 1988.
Right. So this is before the illicit
Yeah.
consecrations. Look what he says in the very opening. Again, this is on the SSPX website, Letter to the Future Bishops. The see of Peter and the posts of authority in Rome being occupied by antichrists. The destruction of the kingdom of our Lord is being rapidly carried out, even within his mystical body here below. And so he thinks that the man who sits in the see of St. Peter is an antichrist. So, and again, as I showed yesterday, there's quotes of him saying it's Rome who's in schism, not
Yeah.
him. It's Rome who's in schism from Christ. So in his mind, he thinks unless he carries through with these ordinations, the church itself is not going to be preserved. So he felt like there was some real necessity here for him to disobey the Pope. Do you have any comments on that before we move forward with your comments on the interview?
Yeah, I mean, in the interview that we're talking about, Michael, these references are not brought up. And I wonder why they're conspicuously avoided, because that's not the only thing Lefebvre said. Lefebvre said many things that were equally aggressive
Mm.
toward the Holy See. And note, he's not just saying the popes, but everybody who holds posts in the Roman Church, the seat of Peter are antichrists. And it's interesting to note that Lefebvre recognizes a schism.
Mm.
He recognizes there is a schism, but he says, you're in schism from the faith and from Christ, not us. So, those who want to maintain that there's no schism between the society and the Roman Catholic Church, Lefebvre himself
Mm.
recognized that there was a schism, that there was a rupture, but he was saying that he was the one that was preserving the faith. The four marks were in the society, not in the Roman Catholic Church.
Now, speaking of schism, one of the aspects of schism could be a parallel church.
Mhm.
I maintain that you don't necessarily have to, institute some kind of parallel church to be in schism, but that issue of a parallel church was brought up, and of course, it was denied that the SSPX is a parallel church. What say you to that point? Do you think that the SSPX is posing itself as a parallel church?
Yes, I do. Now they deny it, but they don't explain why they deny it. If I'm going to make the claim that I think it is, I should try to support that. I think it's begging the question, Michael, because look, let's look at the facts. The
Mhm.
facts are Lefebvre has set up a hierarchy of bishops and priests with its own governance that operates separately from the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, that's not unlike the old Catholics after Vatican I. It's not even unlike the Sedevacantists of our day. It's a separate hierarchy, a parallel hierarchy of bishops and priests. But it's more than that. Okay, Lefebvre and the Society have set up chapels throughout the world, schools throughout the world, seminaries. They've created, let's call it what it is, they've created phony religious orders.
Mm.
The Benedictines out in New Mexico, the Dominicans of Avrier, those are not authorized religious orders. And to top it off, they've created their own tribunal, a parallel tribunal, which not only operates to perform acts of governance that are reserved to either the local ordinaries of the Holy See, but the society requires the adherents to these tribunals, the participants, to swear that they will not go to Novus Ordo tribunals, as they call it. So look, if that's not a parallel church, I don't know what is, because it is setting itself up as its own authority structure and requiring its adherents to promise by swearing on the Gospels that they will not go to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So those are the facts.
And by the way, I want to remind everybody, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Try to help grow this channel. I would greatly appreciate it. By the way, hit the bell for notifications too, so you know when I go live. Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. You know, in the interview, he says, well, they're not claiming any kind of jurisdiction. So because of that, there isn't a parallel church. What do you say specifically to that?
First of all, yes, they are, because if you read the writings of Bishop Fillet and Bishop Tissier, they actually do claim, and I'm quoting, an quote, ordinary episcopal jurisdiction for certain acts of governance, which are connected to how they operate this tribunal. That's in their own writings, in Cor Unum and some of the other writings they have. So they do claim to have a type of jurisdiction. Father McMahon, I think, called it an extraordinary jurisdiction. There's no such thing. There's either ordinary or supplied. There's no such thing as extraordinary jurisdiction. What the society is effectively saying is they have an extraordinary mission, which they do not, because they don't have miracles. But you don't need to claim jurisdiction, Michael, to be a schismatic. Okay, that's the other point, right? Even if Lefebvre intended to perpetuate the episcopacy only through a sacramental powers, that's still schismatic, because only the Pope can determine who becomes a bishop, who is selected as a bishop, who is consecrated as a bishop, and who is sent as a bishop. So it's, you know, that's a matter of divine law. So this argument of trying to divorce jurisdiction, right, the power of governance from the sacramental power, is a non-starter. You can't do that. The episcopacy, by the way, is ordered to governance. Okay, unlike the priesthood, which is ordered to the sacraments of the Eucharist, the body of Christ, the episcopacy is ordered to governing the mystical body of Christ. And so if Lefebvre, you know, thought in his mind that he was bifurcating, you know, governance from the sacramentality of the episcopacy, he had a totally perverted understanding of what a bishop was.
Now, I recall Bishop Fele once had noted something along the lines that their tribunal, you know, coordinates in some cases with Rome on some particular questions related to marriage, if I recall correctly, and Rome will write back to them telling them what to do. And so, in other words, Rome's kind of recognizing their tribunal. Any comments on that?
Well, yeah, a couple. I mean, I've talked to some canonists in Rome, and I shouldn't name their names, but I will say this, and I'm being completely honest. They have told me that in every single case over the years, and I'm talking about every single case where the Roman Rota had to adjudicate whether a society marriage was valid on the basis of supplied jurisdiction, in every case, the Roman Rota held no, supplied jurisdiction did not qualify to society marriages. That is a fact, and you want to talk to canonists in Rome, you can verify that. So that's, you know, that's extremely problematic, and it's contrary to what they're saying, holding themselves out. You know, they work with Rome. The other thing I've heard is, you know, Bishop Fillet say, in cases where people have come to us and confessed mortal sins which have a censure attached to them, you know, we absolve them, and Rome has always approved our absolutions. That can't be correct, because that's not how it works. Okay, how it works is if somebody comes to the confessor with a sin to which a censure, let's say, of excommunication is attached, that's reserved to the Holy See, the priest cannot absolve. It has to get the faculty from the Holy See. Okay, so for Fillet to say they approve our absolutions, that can't be true. Perhaps in the church's mercy, the society has appealed to Rome to say, would you please give us the faculty to absolve this sin and this censure? Perhaps that is done, and I would believe that. I would believe the church might be merciful in that regard. But to say that the church rubber stamps our absolutions prior to them having the faculties to absolve is extremely misleading.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. Now let's shift gears here and let's talk a little bit about the consecrations because that was also brought up in the interview. Were there any things that you felt like, okay, well, this wasn't addressed and it was incredibly conspicuous and should have been addressed?
Well, the first point, and I haven't heard them engage with this argument at all, and I've had it out there for quite some time, is the fact that, again, I'll say it again, the right to select and consecrate and send bishops
Mm,
belongs to the Pope
mhm,
alone. A state of necessity never justifies one to usurp that authority from the Pope because it's an authority that Christ himself conferred upon Peter. And you
mm,
can read this in the Council of Trent. You can read it in encyclicals by Pius VI, Pius IX, Pius XII. It's all over the place. You can
mhm,
go back to the times of Augustine on that recognize this as a divine prerogative of the Roman pontiff, and nobody else can utilize that right without the Pope's consent.
mhm,
The other thing I thought that was problematic, and again, this is very common, is there is a distinction, Michael, between consecrating a bishop without pontifical mandate
mhm.
and consecrating a bishop contrary to the will of the Holy Father.
Okay.
You know, Jim advanced the Michael Davies apologia, right, which says that, well, hey, you know, this right to or this necessity to have a pontifical mandate is relatively new development in the canon law. This was introduced in the 1950s by Pius XII, you know, in reaction to what was going on with the Chinese, you know, Patriotic Association, et cetera. None of that's relevant to the question of schism because Lefebvre was excommunicated both on the ground that he consecrated without a pontifical mandate, but also the schismatic act was that he consecrated contrary to the will of the Holy Father. You
Right.
see,
Right.
consecrating a bishop without a pontifical mandate, as we've always said, is not necessarily a schismatic act. It has happened. Circumstances may permit it in certain cases, but it's never permissible for a bishop to consecrate another bishop against the will of the Holy Father,
Mhm.
particularly when there is a canonical warning of the consequences of doing it. And so it's unfortunate that, again, our society friends have really failed to address that distinction. And again,
Yeah.
I've seen Michael Davies talk repeatedly about this pontifical mandate. It's true. Back in the early church and even in the Eastern church, as you well know,
Mhm.
there wasn't
Mhm.
pontifical mandates for
Exactly.
it. That's not the issue.
Right.
The
Right.
issue is he did something contrary to the express will and canonical warning of the supreme
Right.
authority.
Yeah. So when the Eastern churches were consecrating without a pontifical mandate, that wasn't being done against the express will of the Holy Father, saying don't go through with this and canonically warning
Right.
some, some prelate of doing that. Now, if I recall correctly, isn't there video footage of the ceremony where they ask during the illicit consecration ceremony, is there a pontifical mandate? And they say yes. Did I get that
Yes.
wrong? Can you clarify that?
I think you're correct. That is also my recollection from reviewing the video. And it's the same thing that the Bishop Williamson, for example, did when he engaged in his schismatic consecrations of Bishop Faure and Bishop Aquinas after he was, you know, departed from the society. He, in fact, used the same so-called apostolic mandate that Lefebvre used when he
Hmm.
did his illicit and schismatic consecrations of those two bishops.
Hmm.
So they say yes because they think they're doing something in the name of tradition, but what they're truly doing, which is contrary to the very divine law of the church, they're sending themselves. They're not
Hmm.
being sent by Christ through his vicar. They're sending themselves, and this is what has always been condemned.
Now, I think at one point the question of auxiliary bishops, and certainly I do recall, they mentioned studies that were done
Yeah.
on the consecrations, whether or not this could be done canonically, and so can you maybe comment on that part of the interview?
Yeah, I think Jim's use of auxiliary bishops is incorrect, and it's not just Jim. I mean, the Society Bishop Fillet himself has used this term, saying Lefebvre just wanted to appoint auxiliary bishops, recognizing that they weren't true bishops that were sent by the Pope with canonical mission. But look, they're not even auxiliary bishops. An auxiliary bishop is a bishop who has habitual jurisdiction from a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction, who's one who typically rules over a diocese. And so the society bishops are not ordinary bishops because they don't have an office in the church, they don't govern a diocese, but they're also not auxiliary bishops either, because they do not have habitual jurisdiction under the authority and delegated by a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. So, they throw these terminologies around, but they're incorrect. And your reference to the study, Michael, is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There was a study done, and it was actually commissioned by Archbishop Lefebvre himself. And I do have a copy of the study. Archbishop Lefebvre wanted to know, before he engaged in these consecrations in 1988, whether he had a theological position to do so, or whether the act would be schismatic. That was truly the question he was trying to resolve. Would this be a schismatic act? And the study that was done in the early 80s was done by the lead name on it is Father Bizig, who ended up, leaving the society with a number of priests and then forming the Fraternity of St. Peter. That study concluded that if Lefebvre would consecrate bishops against the will of the Pope and without pontifical mandate, it would be contrary to canon law, and if against the will of the Holy Father, would be a schismatic act. So, look, the position that I'm articulating now, Michael, is the very position that Society of St. Pius X priests articulated to Archbishop Lefebvre before he committed the schismatic act. This is what the study is. I don't know if the study's out there. I do have a copy of it. It may be out there online, but it was led by Father Bizig. And again, their conclusion was, Your Excellency, if you go forward with this, you're going to be committing a schismatic act. And he did so anyway. And then the certain faction of priests left to form the fraternity.
Seems like I've heard them argue canonically, like, if there's some kind of fear on his part, he might not necessarily be guilty of schism, is kind of how they pitch it. Care to comment maybe briefly on that?
Yes, there are mitigating factors, but those mitigating factors never apply when the act is harmful to souls, which is even the case under the 83 Code. Now, misappropriating a divine right of the Roman primacy is going to always be harmful to souls, right? Because it is a direct attack on the unity of the church and on the divine constitution of the church, which is perpetuated as Christ willed by the Holy Father selecting and consecrating and sending bishops. This is what perpetuates what we call formal apostolic succession, where the bishop not only has the sacramental powers, but he has the canonical mission to licitly exercise those powers and carry out the mission of Christ throughout the church. So, that is critical to understanding how problematic the society's position is.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Now, another part of the interview that they focused on was the question of somebody, going to an SSPX chapel. Is that all of a sudden schismatic? So can we talk about the current status of the SSPX?
Well, the SSPX is in schism because that's what John Paul II has declared. I think Cardinal Ratzinger used that term. I think as Pope Benedict, he called it a rebellion, which is the same thing. We even mentioned that Francis referred to the schism of Monsignor Lefebvre. And we also have the direct teaching of the Holy Father that whoever formally adheres to any schism, right, including the schism of Archbishop Lefebvre, is subject to the censure of excommunication. If you're formally adhering to the schism, you would be excommunicated. So, something that came out of Jim and Eric's discussion that I want to note is Jim said, quote, the society he was referring to, he says they are clearly part of the Catholic Church, end quote. And, my question there would be, how do you define the Roman Catholic Church? Because the church has always said if an organization is divided from the church in her government, she's not part of the Catholic Church. I mean, read Mystici Corpus Christi. Pius XII says this very clearly. He says, whoever is divided from the church in her government is not living in the unity of the body, nor is he living in the one divine spirit. So the necessity of being united to the church, not just in her faith and worship, but also her governance, Michael, is a matter of the will of Christ, of divine law. It is a matter of divine law that one must be subject to the governance of the church. That is, subject to the bishops with ordinary jurisdiction. Leo the 13th, for example, says this very clearly in Sanctis Cognitum. He says being a subject legally to the divine governance is de jure divino, he says, as a matter of divine law. So to say that they're part of the Catholic Church is a denial of this, this divine truth that one must be united not only to faith and worship, but governance as well.
Where they kind of hung their hat is they were saying, look, in the old church, if you're mentioned in, on the diptychs, you're effectively saying you're in communion with somebody. If you're struck
Yeah.
from the diptychs, you're saying they're not in communion. And today, the SSPX mentions the name of Pope Francis and the local ordinary in the canon of the mass. And so they're going to say, see, this shows that we're in communion with the Catholic Church. What would you say maybe in response to that?
Well, the popes have said, and I think I can refer to Leo the 13th and Pius the Ninth. They say the mere profession does not necessarily create the juridical reality, right? The mere paying of lip service to the Holy Father, if you're not going to subject yourself to his jurisdiction and authority, then the lip service you pay to him doesn't create the juridical bond of unity. The juridical bond of unity is a legal reality by which you are in submission to the Holy Father through his jurisdiction and the jurisdiction of the bishops that he's commissioned over the church. So it's not sufficient to merely profess to say Francis's name in the canon. I mean, the old Catholics say Francis's name in the canon. At least some of the masses that I've seen, go online, look up the old Catholic Confederation. I was actually shocked to discover that, Michael, because they broke away from the church after the First Vatican Council, as you know, over the teaching of infallibility. And I always wondered, what do they say when they come to that part of the Mass? Well, I heard the priest mention Pope Francis in the canon. And yet the society would be the first to say the old Catholics are schismatics and not in union with Rome. So if their profession is insufficient to make them in union with Rome, why is the society's mentioning of Francis sufficient to make the society united to Rome? It doesn't work.
Now, one thing they did bring up is, look, Pope Francis has granted some faculties for some of their confessions. And so that kind of undoes the claim that if somebody formally adheres to the SSPX, that they're in schism. There's been a whole lot more of rapprochement on part of Rome. And so, Rome's kind of backed away from the schism claim.
Not at all. Pope Francis said just the opposite. First, he said he's doing this as an act of mercy to those penitents. Presumably because he knew that they were not getting valid absolutions because supplied jurisdiction doesn't apply to the Society of St. Pius X. So thank God Francis did that. But he also says he was extending that faculty in this generous and benevolent overture to help bring them into full communion. And so, this granting of a faculty for a single sacrament, and then, of course, conditionally for the sacrament of marriage, only highlights the fact that they don't have faculties for the other sacraments because they're not part of the church. It still highlights the juridical and canonical and legal issues that are at play here. So, to say, a narrow exception makes the rule is, of course, that's not true.
Now, one thing that I thought was interesting is that Jim did acknowledge that there's some canonical irregularity with the SSPX. Can you maybe comment on that description, his articulation of the SSPX?
I thought it was interesting that Jim recognized this, and he's absolutely correct. I mean, I think he said, the term canonical irregularity isn't in canon law. That's right, it's not. I mean, it's been used as a euphemism, quite frankly, to whitewash the status of the society. Well, it's a canonically irregular. No, it's either in the Catholic Church or it's not. It's either juridically united to the church in faith, worship, and governance, or it's not. It either has a canonical mission or it's not. Its bishops either have ordinary jurisdiction from the Holy Father or it doesn't. Its priests are either incarnated and hence have the faculty to exercise the priesthood or they do not. Like I said, if you want to call it canonically irregular, I would say, okay, irregular means not regular, not according to the rule of the church that every other priest in good standing has to follow.
Yeah, there was another part of the interview. I forget the exact words, but you'll recall when I bring it up here. They were mentioning how if you go to attempt the sacrament of marriage in the SSPX, you have to sign a document effectively acknowledging that you're unable morally to go to a Catholic priest, and so you're approaching them. Can you maybe comment on that, and maybe are there potential problems with that?
Yeah, I mean, I find that really troubling, even from a spiritual perspective. Why would they hang that on the bride and groom?
Hmm.
Saying, hey, look, you acknowledge if we're wrong, caveat emptor, buyer beware is the legal term, right? If we're wrong, you guys agreed to it. And
Right.
it's in, conspicuous language. I'm a lawyer. I draft these kind of agreements. I had a chuckle when I heard that, because what would be the purpose of that? And by the way, we're not just talking about, a contractual issue here that doesn't have very grave ramifications. If that marriage is invalid, there's a grave problem, right? The other thing, Michael, that didn't come up, and again, it's great that Pope Francis, having recognized the invalidity of all these marriages and giving local bishops
Mhm.
the authority to grant the faculty for a diocesan bishop, first and foremost, to go witness the society marriage. And only if that's impossible, then to delegate the faculty directly to a society priest. That's how the Pope, set this up. But what didn't come out of the interview is what happens if the local bishop does not give the faculty for the society marriage to be witnessed. What
Mhm.
happens then? Well, I can tell you in my private discussions with society priests, and you know this as well, they do the marriage anyway.
Mhm.
They do the marriage anyway. Now, that is extremely problematic. That is truly schismatic. Again, they're paying lip service. Oh, look, we're legitimate because Francis has given us the faculty, but we didn't need it anyway because if the local bishop rejects it, we're going to do it anyway.
Mm.
Now, what greater sign of separation from the church is there than that? I mean, again, it's paying lip service to the authority of the church, but it's also paying fast and loose with people's souls, because these marriages, if they're not properly delegated and witnessed, are invalid. As I've told you, what the Roman Rota has always decreed, supply jurisdiction does not exist because there's no error there, Michael, in the Catholic community, where they would conclude that a society priest had an habitual faculty to witness marriages. It's problematic. They need the proper delegation. It's conditioned upon the local bishop.
What did you think of Jim's comments on the Second Vatican Council? He says it's a valid council, but it contains some error, namely dignitatis humanae, and so there's a question of its level of authority, and the magisterium should be clear on, whether or not there needs to be adherence, stuff like that. So, what was your impression of that portion?
Well, I think he was kind because the society in its own writings deals with Vatican II much more harshly than Jim presented it. I mean, let's
Mhm.
face it, the society priests claim that Vatican II taught heresy.
Yeah.
That's what they say. The collegiality is one example where they say that's an heretical doctrine, etc. And I got the impression that Jim and the society, is putting the burden on the church to clarify her teaching, but really, and also the level of assent. Okay, that's the burden on the church to tell us that. Well, I would say no. The problem is with the society, not with the church, because the society actually, we talked about the presumption of malice. They actually assume out of the gate that the interpretation is in error, it's erroneous, or it's heretical. They assume the worst and then
Mm.
place the burden on the church to have to come back and clarify it. But that's not how the church has dealt with conciliar texts. I mean, Auctorum Fide, right, laid out the principle that if there is a teaching that could be interpreted in a heretical manner, we are required to reject outright the heretical interpretation and rather interpret the teaching in light of tradition. The society has the opposite approach. There seems to be, Michael, and maybe you agree with this or disagree, I don't know, but there seems to be a presumption of error, and the burden's back on the church to clarify this. That's not how things work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're supposed to presume that there's reconcilability with any kind of apparent contradictions, just like we would with sacred scripture. Now, obviously, in the case of scripture, you also have the question of inspiration that's going to certainly guarantee a harmonization. But in the same way that you would harmonize seemingly contradictory things in sacred scripture, the same principle applies to the magisterium. So really the burden of proof is on somebody to demonstrate continuity rather than demonstrate discontinuity if they're going to make that claim,
Yeah.
rather than just presume it. And insofar as I've been able to tell, I don't see any definitive points of discontinuity between Dignitatis Humanae and the 19th century popes, or even questions of collegiality. That was another thing that was brought up.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back 15 years, 20 years of study for me. My biggest difficulty has been with Dignitatis Humanae, because I've read all of the encyclicals on religious liberty dating back to the 17th, 18th century. And the way I've come to understand or reconcile the teaching in Dignitatis Humanae, the most problematic being that man has a right not to be hindered publicly in his religious teaching and practice. That statement does seem problematic, but I think it could be reconciled if you say you're talking about a person in a non-Catholic state, and you're talking about the civil law. Well, that is true then. A person from a civil law standpoint who lives in a non-Catholic state would civilly have the right not to be hindered in his public teaching and practice. Doesn't mean that the church is saying what he believes is true. Okay, so there are some things that I think can be reconciled with some difficulty. But you mentioned collegiality.
Yeah.
Collegiality, and Jim, quoting him from the interview, said that is a point of departure, from tradition, but he never explained what he meant. It's not at all. I can say this too. I've had private correspondence, and Robert Sisko has had private correspondence with society priests on this matter of collegiality. We haven't really published it, but we're at a point where they can't answer our rebuttals. They do not understand collegiality and what Vatican II is teaching. They make two errors without getting way off target, Mike. I just want to mention these two things because Jim brought it up. It is not a point of departure. It is actually completely consonant with what the fathers held in their schemas at Vatican I, with all the post-Vatican I, pre-Vatican II theology manuals, that Christ established a primacy, which was emphasized at Vatican I, and an episcopate, which was emphasized at Vatican II, the Pope being the head, okay?
Yeah.
And, we know that Christ gave Peter the keys alone in Matthew 16, but he also gave the apostolic authority to the apostles to share in the power of the keys by binding and loosing when they are in hierarchical communion with the Holy Father. And so there is a distinction between the primacy, which Peter alone holds, and the episcopate and the power of supreme jurisdiction that all the bishops collectively exercise when in union with Peter. And the society has erred, and we'll say this definitively, and we can prove this from their own writings. They have conflated the primacy with supreme authority. The society in all their writings say that the bishops do not share in the supreme authority because they think supreme authority deals with Peter's power of primacy. They're two completely different things. The bishops of the Roman Catholic Church, when united to Peter, share in the supreme authority. They are a second subject of supreme authority. This is how they act as definitive judges in an ecumenical council. They don't hold it individually like Peter does, but they share in it because Christ told them as an apostolic college, whatever you, in the plural, bind or loose on earth is bound or loosed in heaven. So they share in the supreme authority that Peter alone holds. That's the first point. And the other point, again, without getting off on a tangent, is the society has conflated the notion of office with jurisdiction. They falsely claim that Lumen Gentium teaches that a bishop receives jurisdiction upon his episcopal consecration. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. They don't even quote it when they say that. When a bishop receives episcopal consecration, the munera, which is also called office, is merely the interior ontological functions that he receives that make him capable of doing acts of teaching and sanctifying and governing, but he can only do those licitly when he gets a canonical mission. So again, they interpret office with jurisdiction. They can play primacy with supreme jurisdiction. It irritates me, Mike, because we've spent so many years studying these things, and they're accusing the church of heresy when just the opposite is true. It's heretical to claim that the church is teaching heresy when she's actually teaching what has been held.
And what would you say to those who push back and say, but look, the Eastern churches, had a canonical mission without the Pope explicitly saying, hey, you have a canonical mission. So doesn't that maybe justify what they're saying?
All mission, if it's canonical, it's at least tacitly approved by the Holy Father.
Yep.
It's at least tacitly approved. It's never contrary to the will of the Holy Father. As I've said before, just as Christ selected and chose and sent his apostles only, right? Only Christ did that. So only the vicar of Christ chooses and sends the successors of the apostles. And so, yes, that's happened throughout history. We've studied this all the way back to Saint Eusebius and how that all carried out during the Arian crisis. Mission was carried out either with the express or at least the tacit approval of
Right.
the Roman pontiff, and never contrary to his will.
Right. Excellent. Now let's shift gears to the last part here, to the end of the interview where they discuss the new mass. That's where I saw, a lot of stuff that the SSPX says about the new mass wasn't really brought out there, and that was a major problem for me. What did you think of that part of the interview?
Yeah, it was very problematic. I mean, again, they just skipped over a lot of the substance of it. I think, Michael, that this is the area they most exploit, I would call it, because, of course, the way the new mass is celebrated in so many places is such a problem, and so it's an easy whipping boy. I mean, it's a great thing to exploit. The problem is they've taken it to an extreme. They don't just reject some of these sacrilegious masses situationally, but they actually reject the Novus Ordo rite in principle. That was the problem, and I think Jim actually conceded that. I mean, if you would ask him, if the Novus Ordo rite was celebrated in Latin, ad orientem, only male altar servers, communion on the tongue, kneeling, the traditional Roman canon, Gregorian chant, I think the society has backed itself into a corner today where they're forced to say that would still be problematic because of the so-called deficiencies in the rite itself. That is an extreme problem for many reasons. Number one, now you're saying that the church and the supreme authority has somehow promulgated a harmful rite, at least on the Latin church. But moreover, they now are admitting that they're refusing communion with 99.9% of the people of the Roman rite.
Yeah.
Think about it. Now that element alone suffices for schism. Remember, schism is the withdrawal of submission from the authority of the Pope or from communion with those subject.
Right.
Clearly, the Society of St. Pius X will even tell you they're not in communion with Novus Ordo Catholics. They're separated from Novus Ordo Catholics in every respect. They will tell people not go to the Novus Ordo. They're completely separated. So again, that's part of that schismatic mentality.
But I think what they would say is, well, we're not refusing communion with the local ordinary. If the local ordinary wants to come celebrate the Missal of 62 with us, yeah, sure, we'll share in communion with him, but we're not going to go to his Novus Ordo. So
what sounds like an inverted pyramid to me.
Yeah, I know. It still sounds like refusing to share in communion with those in communion with the Roman Pontiff to me.
And let's be fair. We're acknowledging a lot of the problems and the abuses, right? I'm saying, and we reject all these errors on the left.
Sure.
But they have gone to the extreme on the right by rejecting a right in principle. I mean, if you look at the right itself on paper, they have taken the position, and I think are dying on their sword on it, that the right itself is defective or evil somehow.
Yeah, another part of the interview towards the end, Jim mentioned communion in the hand is sacrilegious. Now, maybe he misspoke or was trying to communicate something else. Maybe he's just saying like abuses of communion in the hand is sacrilegious, in which case I'd agree. But communion in itself is what it sounded like he was saying. Again, maybe he's just speaking off the cuff. It could be that he just misspoke there. But what did you think of that part about communion in the hand being sacrilegious?
I really think you have to be careful. I mean, look, we're talking about something very grave, and if he didn't intend to say that, well, then he really should clarify what he meant, because he did say communion in the hand is a sacrilege. But that's what I think. I assume that's what he meant, because that's what he said. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what all society priests say, to my knowledge. They say
Okay.
it's a sacrilege. Of course, it's not a sacrilege. Otherwise, the church herself has approved this sacrilege, and the entire practice of the first millennium. I mean, I think in the East, Michael, and you would know that better than me, certainly in the early church in the West, it's not intrinsically evil. It is not a
Right.
sacrilege. It
Right.
could become sacrilegious, and I agree. I mean, I even as a child, I received communion on the tongue in the Novus Ordo. I never felt comfortable with it, so I can understand that, and I'm not downplaying it. But again, it's this absolutist position, this
Yeah.
non-nuanced position of the rite itself is evil, communion in the hand is sacrilege. These are extreme and erroneous positions.
Yeah, it just blows me away that anybody, we just had somebody in the chat right now say it is sacrilegious. It blows me away that anybody could claim to be a Catholic and yet say that something that the apostles did was sacrilegious, and something that the vast majority of church fathers and Christians in
Yeah,
the first millennium did is sacrilegious. That's where it's like, really?
right.
Are you sure? You don't want to walk that one back. You don't want to nuance
Yeah,
that qualification. You don't want to qualify that just a little bit
I
more.
know.
I mean,
I know.
it
I
just
know.
it blows me away. And another part is they recognize. I think they mentioned that they recognize the validity of the sacraments, but I believe that may have been mentioned. Now I know it is at least mentioned elsewhere by some adherents to the SSPX, but then I also have seen some things from Lefebvre where he does question validity, and says in many cases it's uncertain.
Yeah, I can I can quote from his
Uh,
book.
yeah,
You know
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
what he says on this.
Yeah, let's do it.
And
Absolutely.
this wasn't staged. I didn't know you were going to bring
Yeah,
this
yeah,
up.
right,
So,
right, 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 right.
he
Yeah.
talks about, are not priests who lose the faith in the same case. There are already priests who no longer wish to confect the sacrament, according to Trent. No, they say the Council of Trent was a long time ago. Now it's transsignification or transfinalization.
Mhm.
Transubstantiation, the real presence of God under the appearance of bread and wine, not in these days.
Mm,
Archbishop Lefebvre, in his open letter to confused Catholics, is saying that if the priest has a defective understanding of the sacrament, it's of dubious validity. That is not true. That is not what the church has said. The church has always said, and we have this at True or False Pope. We have a couple of decrees from the Holy Office in the late 1800s where the church has decreed that so long as the priest says the words of consecration, he's celebrating the Mass, he's reading from the Missal, that intention is evinced publicly, and hence a sacrament is considered valid. Now, can you have an absolute certainty? No, because what if he withheld interiorly the intention? That could be the case, but the church doesn't judge internals. The church judges externals. And what the
mhm,
church says is if the priest is saying the Mass,
mhm,
he's at an altar, he's reading from the Missal, and he's pronouncing the words of consecration so that
mhm,
he has valid form, and he's using bread and wine so he has valid matter. It's deemed to be valid, period. It doesn't matter whether he understands the sacramental nature, transubstantiation, transsignification, that honestly doesn't matter. I
mhm.
mean, this is why the church has said, Michael, in cases where a Muslim is baptizing somebody, he doesn't understand the
Yeah,
sacramental effect of
sure.
original sin. Even more than that, in one of these Holy Office decrees, a Protestant minister actually before the baptism declared to an extent that this baptism does not wash away original sin. He made statements denying the doctrine of baptism. That was the dubium that was submitted to the Holy Office. Is this baptism by a Protestant minister who denies that original sin is it valid? The church says it's still valid.
Yeah.
Why? Because he used valid matter, valid form, and did what the church does. Lefebvre has made an error because Lefebvre thought that the priest has to intend to do what the church intends and not merely do what the church does. So Lefebvre was wrong on his understanding of sacramental theology.
Can you
period.
imagine if you really did take that position? You could never know that any sacrament that you've received is really valid, because it could be that the person's just lying and they really
It's
don't have an
this
intention.
this is a huge issue because, and this all started with Lefebvre. Okay, the fact that traditional Catholics, under the impression that the Novus Ordo sacraments might be invalid or at least of dubious validity or suspicious. I mean, this started with Lefebvre, and this doesn't just extend to the Mass, Michael. I mean, we know that the Society has conditionally reordained priests who have come from the Novus Ordo. Why? Well, not because valid matter and form weren't used, but only because the bishop may have said something in the sermon that gave the indication that he didn't understand that the priesthood was a sacrificing priesthood or something to that effect. But again, that is an error in sacramental theology. It's irrelevant what the bishop believes the sacrament is doing, as long as he uses proper matter and form and follows the rubrics of the church. And so, this is rooted in fundamental errors in sacramental theology. We're not saying that intention is not required. Intention is required. I'm not saying it's not, but that's an interior intention that the church doesn't judge. You see what I'm saying? The church is only judging what is done externally, and what is done externally is using valid matter, valid form, and following the rubrics as the church has provided.
Now, I want to remind everybody, go ahead and send your questions to At Reason and Theology. We'll take a few chat questions. Let me ask you one last thing. They made some comments about the Ecclesia Dei groups. Those are the ones who, have Latin masses in communion with Rome. And there seem to be some reservations there as well, in cases where someone from maybe the SSP says, don't go to an SSPX chapel. For some reason, people are told, well, no, you may not want to go there, even though, ironically, and perhaps even hypocritically, the SSPX is saying don't go to Novus Ordo churches. I just thought that was, ironic, but maybe comment on that for me.
Well, and Jim admitted that these former Ecclesia Dei groups, the Institute of Christ the King and the Fraternity of St. Peter, he's not saying that they're teaching heresy from the pulpit. What's the problem with these groups? The problem with these groups, according to Vogel, is that they're telling people to be, leery of the Society of St. Pius X, that they're correctly saying that the society is not in good standing. And it's on that basis that Jim explained the society priests are telling people not to go to these communities who are part of the Catholic Church, who have, a mission from the Catholic Church. It's what they say about the society, not what they say about the Roman Catholic faith. So I was like, really? That's a reason? But again, you see that isolationist attitude, that schismatic mentality. It's like almost, they're in their own bubble. Even their fellow priests who are celebrating, I shouldn't say fellow priests, but the priests who are celebrating the traditional mass under the authority of their bishop. Even there's a suspicion. Very problematic.
Here's a question for you. Thank you for the super chat, John. This is I heard John draw a parallel at Frad between the SSPX and the Eastern Orthodox who became schismatics, then heretics. Does schism inevitably lead to heresy? And was he talking about the implications of the essence and energies distinction on the Trinity? God bless you too.
I don't know about the latter part of that question. Yeah. I wasn't talking about the Trinity.
Right.
We can do that another time.
Yeah.
But in terms of a parallel, well, there is a parallel. Yes, all the fathers say that schism leads to heresy or originates from heresy. There's something called pure schism, right? That the heresy is not involved, and it's simply a withdrawal of submission. But it's usually based upon a heresy that gives birth to the schism. That's usually the case. And if it didn't give birth to it, it's certainly going to lead to it. And this is one of the things that the church has warned us about. When you put yourself in that milieu, if you will, you're going to start embracing their ideas, and many of them are grave, and some are even heretical. So that is true.
Yeah, and I would say there's still the case of heresy among the Orthodox, at the very least, when it comes to papal infallibility and papal supremacy, if not the filioque on part of some who deny it.
Sure.
So here's another one from Augustine. Can we privately conclude a de facto schism due to the problems, but because there has been no clear juridical definition, we can still call the SSPX Catholic in light of Canon 18?
Well, I don't think you can say they're Catholic, because to be Catholic, one must be united to the church in her faith, worship, and governance. And the society lacks all three of those juridical bonds. That, I mean, that is a fact. That's why, Cardinal Burke says they're not part of the one Roman Catholic Church throughout the world. Now, we want them to be Catholic, right? I mean, again, we're perceived as bashing the society. That's really not the basis for this. The basis, I think, Michael, you would agree, is to alert the people to the problems, that this is a false solution to a real problem, that much more good could be done if the society were part of the Roman Catholic Church, and we wouldn't have to deal with these questions. God willing, someday.
Can you speak about Bishop Barron regarding the SSPX and his diocese? Some SSPXers are now treating him as a hero. Thanks.
Well, I haven't read the bishop's decree. I've only read what Father Zulsdorf has reported.
Yeah.
And based upon some of my prior readings of him, I don't have a lot of confidence in what was reported. The only thing I know that was reported is that the bishop evidently allowed the society to use a Catholic chapel. Is that true? I don't know. I would want to verify it. I'd actually want to see what the bishop said or what he decreed. In what Father Z has said, there's no mention of whether Catholics can attend those masses, of whether Catholics can receive Holy Communion in those masses, whether those masses satisfy the Sunday obligation. There's so many questions, right?
Sure.
But I think Father Z at one time reported that Barron banned the TLM and then retracted that. So
I think that was the same day.
I mean, I question things that come from his pen, or at least I'd want to verify them. So that's all I know on that.
Yeah, it was that same day that he said that, and he had it was clear he jumped the gun, and he had to come and issue a retraction. And so, okay, if we jump the gun here without really verifying things and having our ducks in order, should we really take what he's saying here without actually verifying it? So it's just another one of those instances where you constantly hear misreports, and but at the very least he offered a retraction there. But for me, if the local ordinary allows for the SSPX in their territory, great. Now that still doesn't remove the question of, okay, but the other things that the SSPX is saying about Vatican II and don't go to the Novus Ordo and things like that, there's still a problem there. But certainly if a local ordinary doesn't have a problem with people going to an SSPX chapel in his territory, okay, well that's applicable for his territory, and okay, good.
Right, I would agree.
Let's see here. I'm looking through the chat. Okay, so Coleman says, I attended an SSPX chapel and received communion a while back. Should this be confessed?
Not to an SSPX priest. I think your best shot is, if you have a scruple about it. Look, there's no culpability, right? If I do think it can be grave matter, but obviously there has to be culpability. It sounds like you didn't know. I wouldn't worry about it. Right. If you want to make a good, solid confession, go to an institute or fraternity priest. They would understand the issue of conscience there. Yeah. But it doesn't sound like you knew.
Yeah. Will the next edition of True or False Pope have a lot of new material covering the SSPX, or will it be a little more of a general revision?
Yeah, we might just put that into a separate book on the society, is something that we're currently considering right now.
Yeah. Could you briefly talk about the SSPX to Sedevacantism pipeline? Is there such a thing? Is it common? Things like that.
Yeah, Michael, I've seen this, and I don't know if you have, but it seems like those who end up in the Sedevacantism camp went through the society at some point on their journey. I don't know of any Novus Ordo Catholic that jumps to, Sedevacantism, in one leap like that. There's usually a transition period, where you start going to the TLM, and then you leave the church and go to the society, and then you get even further and further away and fall into this era of Sedevacantism. I think it's fair to say that that's more common than one just concluding, as a Novus Ordo Catholic, that we don't have a pope. That would be my experience anyway.
Yeah. Jan asks, can one participate in a SSPX nuptial mass if the wedding is approved by the bishop?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and what about if it's not approved? Can somebody?
Well, you'd certainly want to talk to the bishop or the representative delegate that the bishop has commissioned to determine what faculty was granted. I guess you could conceive of a case where the bishop would grant the faculty for the marriage, but not the nuptial mass. But then I think the society would say, forget it. We're saying a nuptial mass anyway. So I think that would be a problem. I'd want to know that the faculties were granted for both. And I'm guessing they probably would be, although I don't know. It's up to each individual bishop. But I would want to find out what I'd want to verify that that faculty exists, because in a society wedding, it could be the situation where there was no diocesan priest available, and the bishop actually delegated the faculty directly to the society priest under the 2017 prescription. That is a possibility, but how would you know that, right? Hopefully, the society priest would be honest with you, and the guys I've talked to were honest with me in saying, "Hey, we're not getting the faculty, and we're still doing the weddings." I'd want to look into that. If you do not have a diocesan priest present at the marriage, I'd want to investigate it further.
Yeah, and by the way, Jean, I see you say please check my super chat. I I thought I had maybe did that earlier. Maybe I didn't. But if you can send me the question again, and I'll confirm. But there is a clarification here from Mike Lewis. He says there's a quote from Father Z's blog. Quote: Bishop Barron wanted his priest to do the marriage and the SSPX priest to celebrate the nuptial mass in that diocesan church, the chapel above. It was a one-time event for the church on that day. So it sounds like it was kind of a one-off thing for a nuptial mass. And of course, the bishop
Yeah,
can
right.
grant an SSPX priest the faculties to do, on a one-off thing, to witness a marriage.
No, that's good. Thanks, Mike. I actually read that this morning, and I wasn't sure if there was a connection, because the first report referred to a college chapel, and then
Yeah,
this report referred to a diocesan church, which seemed
yeah,
to be two different things. But I'm glad you clarified that, because I was wondering if that was in fact the case, and it sounds like it is.
yeah. Yeah, look, Jean, it looks like we did do this one. I heard from John draw a parallel between the SSPX and EO, who became schismatics. Does schism inevitably lead to heresy? We did do that one
Yeah, I could
earlier.
mention in that question, Michael, that just as Paul VI lifted the excommunication upon the Orthodox in 1965, right?
Yeah.
And yet they are still considered schismatics because they are not united to the church, particularly in her governance, also in her faith and worship. You know, Benedict XVI also lifted the declared excommunications on the four bishops in 2009, right? And so a declared censure was lifted on both groups, and yet both groups still remain outside of the juridical structure of the church without a canonical mission. Well, if that's the case, and what I've said is absolutely correct, then how can one hold that the Orthodox are schismatic, but the society is not schismatic on the grounds that the censure was lifted? You
Mhm.
can't on those grounds.
There is another one here that I thought was really, really interesting. Could you comment on the fact that Lefebvre continually denied signing the promulgation of Vatican II documents until his death, even implying malice? Why would he do this?
Well, I can't question his state of mind, but I can say that Bishop Tissier, in his own biography, or was the autobiography, uh, does say that Lefebvre signed all 16 documents. Now, this is coming from Bishop Tissier, who is still alive. Bishop Tissier says he signed all 16. So if Lefebvre claimed, he didn't, then either Bishop Tissier is in error, or Lefebvre forgot, or there's malice. I'm not going to presume malice on the Archbishop's part at all, but I do think the historical record proves his signature on all the documents, including Dignitatis Humanae.
Mhm.
Why he denied that? Well, I'll tell you what, and I've used this term before. He seemed like a double dealer to me. I mean, when the new mass reforms came out, he said, and we quote him in the article that you mentioned at the beginning of the show, he even acknowledged that the Novus Ordo technically satisfies the Sunday obligation. He acknowledged that there were good Novus Ordo masses and bad Novus Ordo masses, okay? And then he flipped on that.
Mhm.
Then 1975 came, and then he said something else, and then 81 came, and he says, no, now it's intrinsically evil. So his position, I think, seemed to get more and more extreme, and that's because he was separated from the church. And once you separate from the church, it ends in more extreme positions. That's what happened.
Yeah, that would certainly explain some of the bombastic language that he used. But anyways, John, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. This was incredibly insightful. I truly appreciate your commentary and your evaluation of the interview. Any concluding thoughts that you wanted to get in there? Anything that we didn't get to cover that you wanted to sneak in? And by the way, put in a plug too for anything that you want to make the viewers aware of.
Again, I think it's best said that the society is a false solution to a real problem. We do recognize the problems in the church and the problems in this pontificate, but I think we need to have patience, as Eric Sammons referred to, right? I think we need to have patience, but more importantly, faith that Christ is in charge of this church. He's only going to permit this crisis to go as long as he wills. And we need to stay in the bark of Peter. We can't take matters into our own hands. We can't leave the structure of the church thinking that there are solutions outside the church. That just leads to further separation and alienation. So let's fight this fight in the church.
Well said. And once again, thank you for coming on. And everybody hit that like button and the subscribe button. By the way, check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to get access to more extra patron exclusive content. And also if you want to support me. See you later. Go.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about